Hello, wonderful person, this is Anton, and I guess let's start with a question. Let me ask you this. What do you think of when you think of fog? Or basically what comes to mind when you imagine fog, or some kind of a foggy morning, or when you find yourself inside the fog in a forest or something? And well, actually, independent of your answer, I'm pretty certain that what we're going to be discussing today based on this new study is going to completely blow your minds and change your perspective on the fog forever. And that's because despite all expectations and despite all preconceptions, turns out that fog is life. Okay, so I might have to dissect this a little bit and go through each individual step just so that it makes a little bit more sense. And that's because, in a nutshell, according to this new research and a lot of evidence behind it, at least certain types of fog, or essentially this unusual wet air that most of us have experienced before, is far more alive than we previously believed, and is far from being just some kind of a weather phenomenon. It literally seems to be a living, growing microhabitat that's actually quite biodiverse and contains a lot of things in it that most of us have never been aware of. And so today we're going to discuss this study from 2026 that officially reveals that bacteria aren't just sometimes found in fog, they seem to thrive in it and seem to create a very unusual ecosystem that may also be responsible for a lot of beneficial effects, including cleaning our air. But before we discuss the study and the biology behind this, let's discuss the basics in regards to fog itself. So, what is it and how does it form? And so let's discuss the physics first. And scientifically, fog is basically just a visible aerosol. It consists of tiny water droplets or tiny crystals of ice suspended in the air extremely close to the Earth's surface, or at least that's the official physical definition. And well, in some sense you can think of it as a low-flying cloud that just happens to be touching the ground. And normally fog forms when water vapor condenses in some kind of a region, usually involving what we refer to as a condensation nuclei. Very tiny bits of particles, normally some kind of a dust, ice, or even salt, that results in the formation of these near-Earth clouds. And by definition, there are several different types of fog, such as, for example, the advection fog, which happens when the moist air passes over a cool surface, or radiation fog, which forms on a calm, clear night as the ground cools down. And while most of the focus in this study is actually on this radiation fog, which, just as a side note, has nothing to do with radiation such as X-rays or gamma rays, and instead is just a very common type of fog that usually forms overnight. And it normally requires clear skies, high humidity, and somewhat calm winds. The National Weather Service actually has this schematic summarizing 3 different types of fog. And in this case, it's the radiation fog that's so interesting because here the air is stagnant, and it basically means that bacteria found inside this fog did not just come from somewhere else because there was wind, but instead were local and came from the same region where the fog started. In other words, by finding something inside of this fog, it must have come from the same location. And on top of this, physically, fog is also really important for a lot of different ecosystems such as forests. For example, the famous redwoods in California, those beautiful trees that are iconic for their humongous size, get approximately 40% of their moisture from various types of fogs and not just from groundwater. So basically we know that fog is already a very important part of the planetary life support system. But this study also discovers that it's not just a life support, it is life itself. Or basically it's an ecosystem and a kind of a home for a lot of different species. And so here a team of researchers from the Arizona State University and Susquehanna University spent approximately 2 years sampling radiation fog in Pennsylvania. And obviously making some really unexpected discoveries. Because here they studied the fog by collecting samples inside of it, using the setup you see right here. And in each millimeter of fog water, they managed to detect approximately 1 million bacterial gene copies. To put that into perspective, this is roughly the same concentration of bacteria you're actually going to also find inside an ocean or a lake. In other words, this confirms that when you walk through a thick fog, you're essentially walking through an aquatic environment as densely populated as your typical ocean. But here's the additional question, I guess. Are these bacteria just stuck in here, or are they actually thriving here? Or basically, are they here because they were captured by fog, or is fog their official home? And to find out, scientists did 2 things. First, they looked at the size of the cells in order to determine what the cells were doing, and the bacteria inside fog droplets seemed to be significantly larger than the ones found in dry air around the fog. In biology, finding larger cells usually means that they're preparing to divide and are basically being active and are thriving in the environment. Second, they also measured something known as FDC, frequency of dividing cells. And here they found that the bacteria in fog droplets were dividing at much higher rates than those in the dry air in the vicinity, which basically strongly suggests that these droplets seem to be a potential aquatic microhabitat where life is actively growing and is using these conditions for their propagation. Or basically, a lot of these bacteria seem to prefer to live inside fog and not around it. With, I guess, the next question being, okay, so what kind of bacteria are we talking about here, and what has been found so far? Well, right now the study found that a genus called Methylobacterium seems to consistently dominate the fog. These are actually specialized methylotrophs, resembling something like this, that seem to survive by consuming C1 compounds, or basically simple molecules like methane, or in this case, surprisingly, formaldehyde. And formaldehyde, as you might know, is not particularly healthy and actually represents a major pollutant in certain regions and especially in the atmosphere. As a matter of fact, it can be toxic to both bacteria and of course humans. But Methylobacterium, and especially the ones living inside the fog, appear to be acting as a natural detoxification hub, consuming formaldehyde as their main source, with researchers discovering that these bacteria were actively breaking down formaldehyde at rates up to 200 times faster than what was previously measured in the clouds. In other words, they were actively using it and removing it from the atmosphere. And this is, of course, a major discovery, specifically for atmospheric chemistry. It means that while we often think of chemical reactions in the air as being purely inorganic chemistry or basically dead chemistry, there is actually a biological component cleaning the air in ways we never expected, and especially if there is fog. In other words, it essentially means that fog is way more important and way more crucial than we ever thought. On top of this raises a question of, okay, so what does this mean for the practice of fog harvesting? The practice of using nets to collect fog for example, drinking water or for crops. Well, in the past we used to think that this water was sterile and was potentially very clean to drink. But based on this discovery, this is far from true. It seems to be teeming with life, some of which could be potentially pathogenic and dangerous. In other words, based on this particular study, it suggests that a lot of things we knew about fog might have been kind of incorrect. And also confirming that a lot of these microbial passengers that we actually thought were passive, this is the idea referred to as aerobiome, or basically microbes in the air, seem to be very active and possibly more active than their cousins on Earth. And this was definitively confirmed by observing 32 specific events during a 2-year period. So this is not something that just happened once. It happened pretty much every single time, with all of the fog water collected being consistently and heavily enriched with this very specific photoheterotrophic microbe referred to as Methylobacterium, with the bacterial growth and division only being affected by temperature. Although its use of formaldehyde is potentially not to use it as food, but instead they just break it down because it's toxic to them, and so they actually convert it into carbon dioxide. So it's mostly converted for protective purposes and not to produce energy. With the overall conclusion from the study being that we should really start characterizing fogs as dynamic functional aquatic microhabitats, not just some kind of a physical phenomenon, and instead a biological phenomenon full of life. And here, naturally, this also has just a bit of implication for potential alien life somewhere out there, and specifically Venus. And that's because for many decades, astrobiologists debated whether microbial life could also permanently reside and survive in the clouds on other planets, like for example on Venus. As you might have heard from other videos or from some other sources, Venus has this region approximately 55 kilometers above the surface, where the overall atmospheric conditions are actually extremely similar to planet Earth. Same pressure, same temperature, and relatively same composition, except that maybe a little bit more acidic. And so by proving that microbes seem to easily survive and thrive by being suspended in the atmosphere here on Earth, we now have at least one piece of evidence that a very similar atmospheric habitability could happen somewhere else. In other words, similar bacteria and similar microbes could be thriving on Venus right now. And we might find out if they're doing this in the next few years as various Venusian missions finally go there to explore the atmosphere. And so this incredible discovery of life inside fog reminds us that life on Earth is extremely persistent. As a matter of fact, in the last decade, it's been discovered in a lot of different places where nobody ever expected life to exist. For example, not so long ago, we've discussed the so-called deep biosphere. This was based on a 10-year study involving 1,000 scientists that revealed that inside Earth's surface, underneath our feet, there seems to be way more bacterial life than inside all of the world's oceans combined. And some of it can actually be kilometers in depth underneath our feet and survive there for millions of years. You can find some of the videos about this in the description. As a matter of fact, at least one study discovered bacteria and archaea living 5 kilometers deep inside the crust, with these organisms never seeing light and never using light, and instead surviving by breaking down chemical bonds inside rocks, minerals, and methane. And surprisingly, some of these microbes seem to have extremely slow life cycles, actually lasting thousands of years. Basically existing in a kind of a near stasis state, or essentially almost always asleep, simply because there's just not enough energy available for more active lifestyles. And well, even more surprisingly, it's not just bacteria. At least one type of a worm, or specifically a nematode, a microscopic worm, was discovered 1.4 kilometers deep inside a South African gold mine. And so here we have at least one complex animal living in total darkness and crushing pressure. So it's not just fog and not just atmosphere, it's also Earth's crust. And that's of course on top of discovering life in some of the most extreme places, such as various acidic hot springs, or the famous Pitch Lake in Trinidad, that's literally a lake of toxic asphalt. And here every single gram of this black goo contains up to 10 million microbes that seem to also thrive in these toxic conditions. Not to mention that even deep inside Antarctica, in places like the Lake Vostok, life has been discovered living in complete isolation for millions of years. So yeah, life always finds a way. But still, the most exciting discovery from all of this is of course something that we kind of took for granted. Something that was always seen as a kind of a nuisance for pilots and drivers, or possibly a backdrop for a horror movie, turned out to be super important and much more alive than we thought. And so fog seems to be a floating aquatic habitat supporting massive amounts of active growing bacteria that may also play a vital role for cleaning toxins from the air we breathe. And so when it comes to understanding fog, this literally changes everything. It's not just some kind of a weather phenomenon, it's literally someone's home. But as researchers continue to find more of similar discoveries and more similar unusual biospheres, at some point we're probably going to be forced to redefine what the word biosphere means. Because in this case, it seems to represent a lot of extreme conditions that we never considered. On that note, once we find out something else, we'll discuss this in some of the future videos. Until then, check out some of the previous videos in the description, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support the channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM me directly, or by joining the channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support this channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.